Kia ora koutou. My name is Maui Hudson. I'm an associate professor at the University of Waikato. I'm a member of the Whakatohea iwi, which is a tribal community in the east coast of the North Island of New Zealand. I have been a co-founder of Te Mana Raunga, the Māori Data Sovereignty Network, GIDA, the Global Indigenous Data Alliance, and Enrich. And today I want to talk about extracting Indigenous resources, in particular as it relates to data and equitable benefit sharing. So the topic of this seminar is all about extractivism and really how it has been applied in the context of Indigenous communities. So we know that many resources have been extracted from Indigenous lands. Indigenous people were often moved off their lands, and the grab for resources. And even when they found themselves settled in particular areas, which at one time may have been thought to be wastelands, when valuable resources were found under the ground, they were once again shifted or had extractive industries forced upon them. But extractivism hasn't just been about the removal of resources from the land. It's also been the misappropriation of cultural heritage and taking those things that are important to communities, cultural heritage items, cultural icons, language, traditional knowledge, and applying them for commercial purposes. And so this whole way of extracting value from lands, extracting value from cultures, is now extended as we realize that data is the place where value can be generated. And so extractivism is now shifted from those physical resources into the digital realm. And ideas associated with open data and the democratization of data are about encouraging that sharing of information, the making available of data from places so that value can be generated from it. And one of the challenges for Indigenous communities is that once again you're taking information that is personal, you're taking information that belongs to a community and you're shifting it into the public realm. And when it's in the public realm, it can then be used by groups, and often there's only certain people that have the technical capability or the resources behind them to make use of them in the kind of way which we're seeing with kind of big data movements. And so in effect that personal information that's been made public is now privatized because it can only be used by a few, and they are doing that so that they can generate value, generate income. So this whole idea of democratization at one level is about the corporatization of what was personal information. And so the challenges for Indigenous communities don't just end there. They're also evident in the ways in which they might like to engage in this new digital economy. And that's because of existing problems that sit within the data and information infrastructures. So every Indigenous community has enormous collections of tangible and intangible cultural material, which is held in archives, museums, libraries, and increasingly all sorts of online databases. But significant information about these collections, including individual and community names and proper provenance information, is missing. Alongside that, the Indigenous peoples and communities are usually not the legal rights holders and therefore have a limited say about what happens with it. And issues of responsibility, ownership, as well as the incomplete and significant mistakes that sit within the metadata of those collections are being transferred through into the digital lives of that material as we engage in these, large-scale digitization processes. Now, that digitization process is not just happening in relation to that historical collections, but as there are more and more researchers working to collect data and samples from communities, new data is being generated at the same time. So this is an innovation which is being put together, the traditional knowledge labels, being developed by Associate Professor Jane Anderson out of New York University, and was put together so that the cultural protocols for sharing knowledge could be located with the information or the artifacts themselves in their digital form. They're machine readable, and they really support the increasing community control and definition of the protocols that should be applied. And they bring those Indigenous protocols into the digital management of cultural heritage items. In doing so, they're in a position to enhance existing metadata, and these labels are now used by over 50 communities and 40 institutions across a whole range of countries. There are 18 labels in existence now. They've all been developed in collaboration with communities. So they've developed as there's been a need from the community for a particular feature or function. This one is TK attribution. And so each of the labels has a why use this label. And this says that this label should be used when you would like anyone who uses this material to know who the correct sources, custodians, and owners are. This is especially useful if the material has been wrongly attributed, or important names of the people involved in making this material or safeguarding this material are missing. This label allows you to correct historical mistakes in terms of naming and acknowledging the legitimate authorities for this material. This label asks for future users to also apply the correct names and attribution. And you'll see here that this material is available, has been translated into Spanish, French, and also Te Reo Māori. So each of the labels has this why use the label. That sits the same. The label itself in terms of the iconography is also kind of fixed. But what is possible is the customization of the language or the metadata associated with the label. And I just want to give an example here of how it's been applied by the Passamaquoddy tribe in the Library of Congress. And this is in relation to one of the first ever recordings made on tribal lands using wax cylinders. And so within the Library of Congress, there was the record, and the record here, as you can see, refers to the tribe where the song is from, but largely is fairly impoverished in terms of being able to talk about anything associated with that tribe. Most of the material relates to the cylinder itself, how to access the recordings, where they're from, who the rights holder is, which is the Peabody Museum at Harvard University. And after engaging with the tribe directly and thinking about how the labels could be used in this context, we now have a new record, a richer record, one that has the traditional knowledge labels visible on the record itself, and you'll see they have the attribution label. They have an outreach label, which says that people are allowed to use this information for outreach and educational purposes, and a non-commercial label, which says this material can't be used for commercial purposes. But alongside that, you see the record itself now has a much richer account or a much richer set of metadata from the communities themselves, which they are now comfortable with having included in this context, because there continues to be an enduring acknowledgement of their relationship with this material. And sitting behind this process of changing the record was the need to transform the digital infrastructures that support these activities. And so here you see the MARC record, and now there's been changes to the fields so that traditional knowledge labels themselves can be recognized. This means that any item being held within the Library of Congress can now have a traditional knowledge label with it if appropriate. And you'll see how this has been present not only in the MARC field but also in the JSON files. And so, that space for traditional knowledge labels to be included is now hardwired into the infrastructure. And of equal importance has been this the recognition of the rights that are associated with cultural and intellectual property, and the use of the traditional knowledge labels sitting alongside the intellectual property rights held by the Peabody Museum within the rights advisory. So each of those labels now are given prominence, and recognition of those rights occurs through this process. So the traditional knowledge labels have been developed over the last 7 or 8 years. Over the past year, I've been working with Professor Jane Anderson to develop a set of biocultural labels, labels that could be used to recognize Indigenous interests in genetic resources. And so the set of biocultural labels which we had developed, which are all about connecting protocols from communities to data itself, are sitting here. And you'll see there's the first one is a provenance label. The provenance label is very much aligned to the attribution label within the traditional knowledge label set of labels. There's a consent verified label, obviously important in the context of the Nagoya Protocol and the need to ensure that there's been informed consent. One of the other components is the idea of mutually agreed terms. And so then you have another set of labels here that allow for research use, that indicate that the community is open to collaborations. So given that these are the sorts of things that are informing future uses, being able to signal to next users of the information, next users of the data, that this community is interested in collaboration or this community is interested in commercialization, provides a mechanism for engaging with those benefit sharing discussions that need to take place, and ones that have been separated from the community themselves through open data initiatives, which mean that data that's been generated from a particular relationship is now available to others, and others that don't have a relationship with the community. So the labels provide a link back to the community through the provenance label, and also an indication of which communities are interested in engaging in different ways. And you'll see the final label there is the multiple community one, which is recognizing that while a community might have engaged in a project that generates data from genetic resources, they may not be the only community that has a relationship with that particular species. So that's the points that we wanted to talk to. In particular, really just highlighting the need to recognize that the generation of data and the shifting of data into open environments is another misappropriation. It's another way of taking a resource or that has value to communities and moving it into a space where it can be captured by others. And so one way in which that dynamic can be mitigated is by ensuring that the data that's moving into those spaces retains a connection back to Indigenous communities so they can be a part of future activities. Ko reira, tēnā koutou katoa.